Back on the Chad Easty Show, News Talk KFYO. We go to the phones. Republican strategist Matt Mackowiak joining us this morning. Matt, good morning. How are you today?
I'm doing great, Chad. How about you?
Doing great. I'll ask you a question that I've asked the listeners this morning, and the answers have kind of been all over the place. How do you think the president has handled this entire situation, after the death of George Floyd, to the riots, to what happened yesterday? How do you think the president has handled everything?
Yeah, look, this is a difficult situation. It is primarily a local, kind of a local law enforcement, a local community effort at this point. I'm not sure that the president sort of nationalizing this would be the right move at this stage. Every city's different. Every city's handling it different. Some cities don't really have much of a problem. Other cities have significant problems. So, look, I do think a national address urging calm, but also making clear that order will be restored would be a good thing. I think it would have been a good thing several days ago.
Yeah,
I think it still would be helpful. I do think his decision to certify Antifa as a terrorist organization, I think, is long overdue, and will probably give the federal government some tools to identify those individuals, to see if they're crossing state lines, to make plans to be violent. So I think that was good. Look, I don't support tear gassing peaceful protesters, which is apparently what happened in Lafayette Square before he went over to St. John's Church yesterday. If they were truly being peaceful, that's very, very wrong, and I oppose that. I do think from a visual standpoint, from a symbolism standpoint, the president going over there yesterday at the site of a location that had been attempted site of arson was meaningful. It was a sign that we don't need to be afraid, that we're going to overcome this, and that we can rebuild and we can save these things that are being targeted. So I think the challenge here is folks on the left see this as basically a movement about peaceful protests that's being hijacked by a small number of people coming in from out of town trying to cause trouble, whereas I think most people in the middle or on the right see this as a situation where there's riots and looting in major American cities, and that cannot possibly be allowed to continue. So this is a dicey situation for the president. I wish he was a little bit more active. I wish he was trying to sort of urge calm around the country and trying to unify the country. He sees this as a law and order issue principally, and I'm not sure I disagree with that, but I do think there's a sort of unifying theme or unifying message that could also be really helpful in a moment like this. But I think the protests are likely to continue until the administration and some of these cities start to look at needed reforms to prevent the next George Floyd type of situation. Unless you address the underlying concerns that are fueling these protests, they're likely to continue.
Let's get into the politics of all this, because there's politics at play, and we're going into a presidential election. Joe Biden yesterday said that he would end racism and injustice in America if he's elected president of the United States. If I'm the Trump campaign, Matt, I'm looking at Joe Biden, who's been around for 70 years. Who, if you haven't addressed it by now, how do you address it? And is that something that the Trump campaign can kind of play up, that Biden's been around for so long? If he hasn't solved it by now, there's no possible way he can solve it?
Well, I certainly think that's an approach they can use on a range of issues against Biden. He has such a long record. He's been all over the place, taking votes on both sides of issues, made lots of promises. And that really probably hasn't come true. He hasn't had a ton of success in that regard, and it does raise questions that when you had the White House and the House and the Senate, why did you not do that, which they had for almost a year and a half when Obama got elected. I don't know how you, quote, end racism. I don't even know what that would, how you would measure that or how that could ever be achieved. What you want to do is reduce it as much as possible. And certainly you want to, reduce it in terms of systemic racism. One of the things about all of this that is so disappointing for me is, that
that 99.5 or 99.8% of police officers do their job the right way in a very difficult situation with they're putting their lives on the line every day. What's so sad is that what the policing, when it's successful, is most often happens when there's a partnership with the community, when there's trust. And incidents like what we saw in Minneapolis really break down that trust. And if you live in Miami or you live in Raleigh, North Carolina, or you live in Austin or wherever, or Lubbock, there's no reason for you to feel less trust with your police department based on what happened with a handful of officers in Minneapolis last week. But unfortunately, I don't think that's what's happening. I think people are starting to say, look, if that can happen there, it can happen anywhere. Look at all these incidents that have happened. You had a lot of these incidents happen in the Obama and Biden years, and you certainly didn't see nationwide protests. Yeah. Now, obviously, this has been building. It's been building, and I think in the Floyd situation now, there really aren't even two sides to the story from what we've seen. I mean, it's pretty clear there was no reason for this individual to be put in a chokehold for 8 minutes when he said he couldn't breathe. This was a senseless killing, and I do hope the murder charge sticks and that they get a conviction.
Do you think the reason we're seeing these riots, in the nationwide anger that's out there, it's more than just the Floyd issue, that it is the nationwide lockdowns, the 40 million people who are unemployed, the fact that, from the media for the last 4 years now, Matt, it's been doom and gloom, and that, the president's evil, and that the president's supporters are evil, and that there's a lot of doom and gloom out there. I mean, it's just, to me, it's been a powder keg situation just building in this country.
Yeah, and there is a lot of desperation out there right now, and I don't want to justify looting for people who are maybe in desperate situations, but I don't see how getting a new pair of shoes or a new purse, at a retail store helps you on a day-to-day basis. There's just simply no justification for the looting. I think it's outrageous. I think every single one of those people they can identify ought to be criminally prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. That's taking advantage of a chaotic situation for your own benefit. And it's got nothing to do with addressing these issues related to policing and systemic racism, those kinds of issues, right? So do I think there are other reasons? Do I think everyone's mad simply because of the Floyd situation? No. I think the Floyd situation kind of sparked the fire, but the fire maintains, its intense burn because of a lot of these other reasons. I don't necessarily think the protests are a response to the lockdowns. I think they're a response to, the unemployment, the reduced, compensation people are dealing with, the uncertainty in their own lives, combined with, feelings of despair about race in America. So, look, this is really, really tough. It's a tough situation. We've got to have a national conversation on policing. I am as pro-police as any person you'll ever encounter. But there have to be changes that prevent these kinds of things. I put on Twitter yesterday, I thought, two really sensible reforms that I've seen put out there are, number one, ending the use of chokeholds by police, and number two, requiring other police officers to step in and interrupt someone if they're breaking the law. And that's one of the reasons I believe the other three officers haven't been charged, is that it's apparently not illegal if you're witnessing an officer break the law to stop them. And so, in a normal situation, had three people, been in a car when one person did something illegal, they'd all be charged. Apparently that's not the case in the police situation. So to me, I'd like to see this focus more on those reforms, other, smart ideas. We don't want to make it harder for police to do their job. We don't want to make it riskier for them to do their job, but we have to improve the situation so we don't have another George Floyd situation, in the near term. We want to try to reduce these kinds of incidents. There are always going to be questions around situations with police, right? There's more attention being paid to their actions, their decisions, which are obviously made in split seconds with difficult and then sometimes varied information. But to me, I'd like to see this get away from looting and rioting and get this towards a reform discussion. I think that's what would truly honor George Floyd's memory.
Matt, before we let you go, I'm guessing Amy Klobuchar is probably now out of the Veep stakes as far as vice president goes.
Well, if we look at it, right now, it would seem to me that that would be a probably difficult choice. and that even that former VP Biden, is more likely to choose an African American. Of course, who knows where the country will be 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks from now. Apparently, he told some donors he expects to make a decision and an announcement around August 1st. So that's 2 months from now. A lot can change. He's got imperfect options everywhere. I do think the Klobuchar thing was oversold. It was initially said, she could have, prevented this bad cop from continuing to be on the police force, when in fact it was a grand jury that was considering that. She had no role. So I do think that story was oversold. But yes, this complicates the VP search, and this is why he never should have said at the beginning, I'm only going to choose a woman. Yeah. Because he limited his options from the beginning. There's only 3 or 4 probably legitimate VP choices. And now with Klobuchar being from Minnesota and being a white woman, it probably, takes her and sidelines her. So you've really only got 2 or 3 probably, legitimate options now, one of which being Elizabeth Warren, who I think would be a pretty aggressive choice for the progressive left. I think it increases the odds. Kamala Harris, the Democratic Senator from California, is the ultimate choice.
Yeah, absolutely. Matt, tell folks about your newsletter, how they can sign up, and also your podcast.
Yeah, the newsletter is called Must Read Texas. We take all the top news from around the state, put it in one clean, easy-to-read email, and deliver it to inboxes by 9 a.m. Every weekday. You can sign up for a free 1-week trial at mustreadtexas.com. The podcast is called Mac on Politics. Most recent episode is with former HHS Secretary Tom Price talking about coronavirus and where things are headed. You can check it out on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and Spotify.
All right, Matt, as always, appreciate your time. We'll talk to you next week.
Yeah, sounds good. Take care.
That's Matt Mackowiak here on the Chad Hasty Show. News Talk 95.1 FM and 790 AM KFYO.